Hello everyone, and welcome to your complete and ultimate KEQING guide. KEQING is one of the characters who massively improved with the advent of Dendro, and considering she is a commonly obtainable 5-star character, this video is to hopefully guide any current or future KEQING owners on how to roughly build her. This video will cover all of the following in order: general playstyle, talent overview, weapon options, artifact sets and stats, team comps, basic combos, Constellation Overview, and an Abyss 12 showcase, all in an as condensed manner as possible. As I don't normally cover combos, this guide will be a bit longer and slightly more in depth than normal, but I did feel they were quite important to include, especially for just optimizing KEQING's overall damage. With all that out of the way, let's get right into the guide. KEQING's playstyle is typically as an Aggravate DPS, with her focusing on doing as much electro damage as possible when paired with a Dendro teammate. KEQING's entire kit is used in her gameplay, but she does have a primary focus on her electro-infused charge attacks, as it makes up the majority of her DPS. This charge attack is a double-edged sword though, as it will often fling smaller enemies quite far back, making her have to dash up to catch up to the enemy. This, when combined with her higher than normal stamina cost for her charge attacks, often causes her to have significant stamina issues. As such, running her with sets like Thundering Fury, as well as proper stamina management, are going to be integral to her overall gameplay. KEQING relies on all parts of her kit for her DPS, especially with Thundering Fury, where she can often cast a skill to maintain infusion, as well as her burst due to its low energy cost. However, she is still reliant on a lot of her teammates, both in terms of damage and buffs. While she has been improved a lot because of Dendro, her own personal damage just cannot compete with a lot of other DPS characters at higher investment, as well as even against the current meta like Hyper Bloom, which is low investment. Having good sub DPSs like Kazuha or Nahida in the team can also help her clear waves of weaker enemies, so KEQING will not have to spend as much of her stamina running around dealing with them. That said, she is still fairly strong when heavily invested into, especially in scenarios where she can fight larger enemies or bosses who cannot constantly be knocked back by her charge attack. However, aside from her Aggravate playstyle, KEQING is kind of horrible to play in any other team comp. Mono Electro just isn't sustainable enough damage for her, and Physical is, well, pretty much a dead playstyle at this point in time. As such, I always recommend sticking to Aggravate KEQING, as it's just the easiest to play and offers the highest DPS. KEQING's normal attacks when not infused are nothing special. They deal physical damage and have 5 total hits. Her charge attack is a bit more special though. It does 2 heavy hits that can stagger or even knock back weaker enemies. At talent level 10, this has a total 322% damage multiplier, which is higher than most characters. However, this has a massive caveat, and that it's higher than normal stamina cost. For most characters, their charge attack costs 20 stamina, but for KEQING, hers costs 25 stamina instead. This poses a number of problems to her overall gameplay. Firstly, KEQING takes a fairly big step backwards with each charge attack she does. Secondly, because this is a heavy hit, she also tends to knock back enemies, meaning she has to dash forward in order to catch back up to them. Thirdly, her charge attack AoE, while decent, isn't very far-reaching, further pushing the problem that she will very often run out of stamina in general gameplay from having to dodge and then needing to catch up to enemies because she's too far away from them, and then she needs to do her charge attack which costs more stamina, etc, etc. There are several ways to circumvent this, whether it's relying on teammates to get rid of weaker enemies, or building her with Thundering Fury so she can use her skill more, which teleports her directly to an enemy. Either way, stamina management is very important when playing KEQING, as running out of it will mean a drop in both her DPS as well as not being able to dodge enemy attacks. Despite all these issues though, this charge attack does make up the majority of KEQING's DPS, and so I still consider this talent the highest priority to level. Moving on to her elemental skill. Upon casting this skill, KEQING will throw a stiletto to a nearby enemy, generally the closest one to her. This stiletto mark will stay on the field for a maximum of 5 seconds. She can also hold the skill to aim it specifically if you want to throw it at a particular spot. Once the stiletto is on the field, KEQING can do one of 2 things. Firstly, if she does a charge attack, the stiletto will turn into a slash that deals AoE electro damage. I would just like to say that this is completely and absolutely useless, and should pretty much never be used. The second option is to recast the skill, which teleports her to the stiletto position and deals one big electro slash. Once you recast the skill, KEQING will gain electro infusion to her normal, charged and plunge attacks for 5 seconds. As her charge attack makes up the bulk of her DPS, this skill is very important for her sustained electro damage. The teleport is also quite useful in the overworld if you need to get to specific spots that would otherwise be difficult to get to. Regardless of which version of the skill you do, either the recast or the charge attack, they both will do the same amount of damage, with a 302% damage multiplier at talent level 10. But you should just always use the recasting version, since that provides her with infusion, as well as helps a ton with stamina management by helping her teleport to the next enemy right away, rather than have to dash towards them constantly. I definitely recommend leveling this talent, as she relies on this a lot, especially if you play her with Thundering Fury, where you will be casting this a ton. This skill generates 3 electro particles when it hits an enemy, has no ICD on the cast or recast, and has a 7.5 second cooldown, though it can be reduced for permanent infusion uptime with Thundering Fury. KEQING's Elemental Burst, when cast, deals 1 instance of electro damage, then 8 slashes before doing 1 final big slash. The scaling of this burst is quite low, with an 843% damage multiplier at talent level 10. It also has a deceptively small AoE and standard ICD, but this does have a very low energy cost of only 40, as well as a decently short cooldown. Because KEQING's skill can be cast so often, and her decent particle generation from said skill, KEQING can usually burst pretty much every rotation, even if you don't build her with any energy recharge. Overall, this burst isn't amazing, but it's still worth leveling since it can be cast so often, and thus still making up a decent portion of her overall DPS. Finally, we'll briefly go over KEQING's passive talents. Her A1, as mentioned previously, gives her electro infusion when she recasts her skill. Nothing to say there. Her A4 gives her an additional 15% crit rate for 8 seconds after using her burst. This is quite useful to her average DPS, especially since KEQING generally opens up her initial rotation with her burst. But as I'll mention later in the artifact section, I would not personally sacrifice her crit rate stats because of this passive, since it doesn't have 100% uptime. Now, because KEQING is a pretty standard DPS and most 5-star swords are DPS focused, her weapon selection is incredibly wide. Now, first of all, I want to mention that every 5-star option you see here in my sword inventory will do well and outperform her 4-star counterparts. If you have any of the 5-star swords here, feel free to use them on KEQING. Starting with her best in slot options, we have the Mistsplitter Reforged and the Primordial Jade Cutter. In a single rotation, KEQING can very easily get all 3 stacks of the Mistsplitter, which gives her an additional 40% elemental damage bonus. Using the Mistsplitter does have a slightly different combo than the other weapons if you wish to use her burst though, as you will need to do a single N1 to proc the very first stack of the Mistsplitter. This weapon is generally KEQING's best in slot, offering a ton of elemental damage as well as crit damage as a substat. Really strong weapon overall, and in my opinion, still the best 5-star weapon in the game. As for the Jade Cutter, assuming you have similar artifact quality, this will generally lose to Mistsplitter in terms of damage slightly. However, it has an unconditional passive, which gives a ton of attack, meaning you will not have to worry about stacks, and its massive crit rate substat will also help those with difficulties balancing their stats, making this a better weapon for those who do not have very good artifacts. If you have either of these weapons, these are going to generally be KEQING's best options. For all the other 5-star weapons, they perform pretty well and will do more damage than her 4-star counterparts, but will lose to the top 2 weapons by a long shot. Harange Bakufutsu generally takes the 3rd place, as the boost to normal attack damage is quite good, since KEQING will be proccing a lot of aggravates with her N1. However, it doesn't boost her skill, burst, or charge attacks, which generally make up a bigger portion of her DPS. The Lofi, Freedom Sworn, and Summit Shaper are all good options as well if you aren't using those weapons on other characters, as KEQING can take advantage of all of the passive of these weapons fairly decently. Moving on to 4-star options, the Black Sword is generally going to be KEQING's best option in general. It boosts her normal and charge attacks by a decent amount, and has crit rate as a substat. But this weapon is a paid option from the Battle Pass, so it isn't as accessible to obtain or refine for most people. Alternatively, the Lion's Roar is also a good option for KEQING, but only if the passive is active. The biggest caveat with this weapon is mainly if you play with Nahida, as Nahida's super strong Dendro application often eats up the electro gauge on the enemy, meaning the passive of this weapon will go kinda wasted if you cannot maintain the electro aura on the enemy. This weapon's usefulness will depend on the teammates you play with. Next up, we have the EM weapons, the Iron Sting, Tokabushigure, Zephyros Moonlight, and Alley Flash. These are all quite good as they allow you to run an attack % sans instead of an EM one, since they will generally fulfill KEQING's EM requirements. Each one has their own benefits over the other. The Zephyros Moonlight will give KEQING more than enough energy recharge for permanent burst uptime. The Iron Sting and Tokabushigure both allow her to do more damage. Finally, for 3-star options, Harbinger of Dawn continues to be a great low investment option for newer players, even if its passive is a little difficult to maintain. Dark Iron Sword is also a very easily obtainable EM weapon that has a pretty decent passive. For KEQING's artifact stats, as a standard DPS, she naturally has very normal DPS build paths. Firstly, for your main stats, your goblet should naturally be electro damage, and your circlet should be crit. However, your sands will vary depending on your team members. If you play with any teammates that share a significant amount of EM, such as Nahida or a Constellation to Kazuha, then the need for an EM Sans generally goes down significantly and you should run an attack % one instead. If you don't have such characters that share a ton of EM to KEQING, then using an EM or attack % Sans are both fine, and will generally chalk up to your substat quality. Just use the one with better stats. As for your actual stats themselves, I will recommend targeting 70% crit rate as usual, and at least 160% crit damage assuming you are not using a crit weapon. This amounts to roughly 200 crit value in artifacts alone, which is definitely achievable with enough farming. I know some people would say that she can lower her crit rate requirements thanks to her A4, but that's really mostly copium. While it is true to an extent, the reason why you should not sacrifice your crit rate just for this is because this won't have 100% uptime on its passive, and there are still a lot of situations where KEQING will not open her rotation with her burst. As such, it's better to just remain consistent with high crit rate. KEQING doesn't really have an EM quota to hit, as that highly varies on your party members. For example, in my case, I often play her with Nahida as well as a C2 Kazuha, which gives her a maximum of 534 EM, which is way more than enough. Naturally, I know most players don't have such a luxury, but it still heavily varies. I would say if you don't have an EM sharing character in the party, try to hit 200 EM, which is very easy to do if you use an EM Sans. If you do have someone that shares a lot of EM, like Sucrose, Nahida, or Kazuha, then EM becomes a much lower priority and should just be targeted in substats instead of your main stat. For KEQING's artifact sets, I will recommend a few, but the first option is really the only one I personally feel is worth using in an Aggravate team. Kicking things off, we have 4-piece Thundering Fury. This is unquestionably her best option in Aggravate gameplay, which chalks up to several big reasons. Firstly, proccing consistent aggravates will allow her to have permanent electro uptime on her normal and charge attacks. Her infusion lasts 5 seconds, while her skill cooldown is 7.5 seconds. As such, the cooldown reduction from this set bonus will allow her to cast her skill again even before her infusion ends. I mentioned this in the talents section, but because KEQING normally has stamina issues from using her charge attacks and needing to dash up a lot to catch up to enemies, her more frequent usage of her skill will allow her to teleport to enemies directly, which negates the need for a ton of dashing. Overall, this set is going to be KEQING's best option in terms of overall DPS and quality of life gameplay. And unless your 4-piece set bonus is really bad, I would not recommend using a different set. Next up on the list, we have 4-piece Gilded Dreams. This set will give her a ton of EM, which allows you to run an attack % sans instead. However, this set is not as good as Thundering Fury in terms of both damage and gameplay, so I only recommend this if you have a very good set for it. Next up, we have 4-piece Thunder Soother. This set is a little hard for me to recommend, as similar to the Lion's Roar passive, it can be a bit difficult to maintain the set bonus if you play with Nahida. This is an okay set in terms of damage if you can maintain the passive, but it's just worse than Thundering Fury overall. Finally, for those who have difficulties getting any of the above 4-piece sets, you can opt for a variety of 2-piece options with Thundering Fury, Gilded Dreams, Wanderer's Troop, and any of the attack plus 18% sets all being viable. KEQING is heavily focused on Aggravate teams, so her team comps shouldn't be anything surprising. I won't be bringing up any other team comps as they generally just don't perform that well or consistently. She naturally needs a Dendro teammate, ideally Nahida, but any of the other off-field Dendro appliers work as well. Dendro Traveler offers some damage bonus and extra EM, while someone like Yao Yao offers healing. Her other 2 teammates are pretty much flex slots, and there are a ton of options you can use. Kazuha is going to be one of KEQING's top options as a team member, as he will boost her damage by a ton. Additionally, Kazuha's massive AoE and swirl damage are often enough to take out waves of trash mobs, which are usually a point of difficulty for someone like KEQING. Sarah is also going to be a pretty good teammate for her, as she will boost KEQING's damage by a ton, though admittedly, maintaining her buff might be a little awkward in certain rotations. She can also opt in with sub DPSs such as Fischl or Beidou, and other defensive options like Kuki Shinobu for healing or Zhongli for shielding also work just fine. I'd just like to bring up something related to playing her alongside Kazuha and Nahida. Because of Nahida's strong Dendro application, getting the enemy to have the Electro Aura stay on them is going to be a little bit difficult, which in turn makes it very difficult for Kazuha to swirl Electro in order to buff KEQING's damage. As such, I always recommend opening the rotation by applying Electro on the enemy first, either with KEQING herself or another Electro teammate, then swirling with Kazuha before beginning to apply Dendro with Nahida. This way, you get Kazuha's massive buff for her opening rotation, which will front load a lot of KEQING's DPS, especially for her burst. In general, KEQING is quite reliant on her teammates for support. Her own DPS, while heavily improved with Aggravate, is still very far behind in terms of the meta, and she also doesn't scale amazingly with vertical investment either. As such, having strong supports like Fischl, Nahida, Kazuha, Sarah, etc. are all going to aid her a ton in her overall gameplay. Okay, so I just want to get into some basic KEQING combos. These are very minor optimization tips that you can very easily implement to increase the overall damage of KEQING's rotations. Firstly, as mentioned in the previous section, if you play Nahida with an animal character like Kazuha, you are going to want to apply Electro onto the enemy first, swirling Electro, then setting up with Dendro for KEQING to come in with Aggravate. Next, the combo I'm about to show you only applies to Thundering Fury players, as the skill cooldown reduction opens her to these general optimization tips. The opening combo for KEQING's rotations should generally go like this. Once she comes on the field, cast her skill, then her burst, then do her skill recast, then do N1 or N1CA, following which her skill will be off cooldown, then use her skill again, as well as the recast, then follow up with continuous charge attacks before restarting the rotation. During this charge attack spam period, you should also just use her skill whenever it's off cooldown, as it brings her back closer to the enemy, maintains her Electro Infusion, and gives her particles for her next burst rotation. For those using the Mistsplitter Reforged, your opening rotation will go slightly differently due to the first Mistsplitter stack. KEQING's rotation should go in this order: skill, skill recast, and 1 into burst. Once her burst ends, her skill will be off cooldown, after which you should use it again and then go into the same charge attack spam. Doing this combo will allow her burst and the first follow-up skill to have all 3 stacks of the Mistsplitter, as losing the first stack is quite a big DPS loss. Now, these combos aren't very complicated to do, and you don't necessarily have to follow them either, but because they aren't very difficult, I do recommend implementing them into your rotation, as they just generally do better damage than a typical Unga Bunga one. KEQING has some of the worst constellations in the game, as while they do focus primarily on minimally increasing her electro damage, their impact isn't as large as the majority of other characters' constellations. Constellation 1. This adds 1 extra instance of electro damage when she recasts a skill. Unfortunately, the damage from this is quite pathetic, so this constellation just sucks overall. Constellation 2. Pretty self-explanatory constellation. It's decent, but KEQING didn't have very high energy requirements to begin with, so it's not really super useful. Constellation 3 and Constellation 5 increase her skill and burst talents respectively. Nothing special there. Constellation 4. This increases her attack by 25% after proccing an electro reaction, which KEQING will definitely do a lot of in Aggravate. This constellation is pretty decent, but also not amazing. Constellation 6. This is KEQING's best constellation. With every possible proc of this constellation, she will gain a maximum of 24% electro damage bonus, which is quite a significant amount, but as a C6, this is pretty weak. All in all, KEQING's constellations are just not very good. They don't affect her a ton or improve her gameplay utility, but still, many players are bound to get a few of them since she is a standard 5-star character overall. Finally, onto the Abyss Showcase. I'll be playing Aggravate KEQING on the bottom half of Abyss 12 alongside Kazuha, Nahida, and Kuki Shinobu.
すがね。しっかり立ってな。まだ剣よ、影に従え。理解よ、Ji-Eun。風よ、もみちろ地図。
これこそが知恵の伝道。
私に神聖を。万物を滅ぼせ。
手をつなぎましょう。めまいが
神聖。
おとなしくしな。
張り込みなさい。
雲が借りなくと風
覚えたわよ。
行け。健康よ、世の乱れを切り尽くせ。陣営のごとく。はっディアはっはっは風の赴くままに。
痛くしちゃうかも、私のお家に。
はい、マジよ。もみちは散らまく惜しみ。風よ、
覚えたわよ。
行け。はっまだ剣よ、影に従え。ディア役払い。風をしろ。はっしっ陣営のごとく。はっ急がないと。渚のリー
張り込みなさい。
陣営のごとく。まだ剣よ、影に従え。瞬く間に。はっよっディアそりゃ。いや、しっかり立ってな。
覚えたわよ。
はっ風よ。はっディアはっいけ。はっ瞬く間に。はっもみちら散らまく惜しみ。
私のお家にいらし。
行け。健康よ、世の乱れを切り尽くせ。ふわっそりゃはあディア役払い。
張り込みなさい。
瞬く間に。やっはあ逃がさない。はっ前へ。はっいけ。そりゃはあ風よ、陣営のごとく。はあ瞬く間に。はっはあ急がないと。おとなしくして。風の雲の湯。我が剣よ、影に従え。
Thank you for watching this KEQING guide. I hope it was useful, and I wish everyone the best of luck building KEQING. Do check out twitch.tv/DukC as well, where I often stream Genshin Impact. Thanks once again for watching, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Take care.